Thank you for asking me along this evening and your interest in my grandfather, Stanley James, who had a very strong Walthamstow connection. Of all the places he went to in the world, Walthamstow was absolutely central in his work and development. And I hope I'll be able to bring that out this evening. But he went to many, many places. So I should be roaming the world or roaming Canada and the UK to follow his unorthodox life. So thank you very much for coming along this evening to hear about someone I presume you know nothing about. I didn't know much about him either until about 2 years ago, even though he is my grandfather. He isn't famous, nor was he famous in his day. So why Stanley Bloomfield James, 1869 to 1951? This is a photo of him when he was minister at Walthamstow. Sometimes I believe those standing in the back row of history, if you like, have a more gripping story to tell than those at the front. It's almost as if, because they escaped the searchlight of fame, they've been left to live out their dreams. In addition, my grandfather was restless, over-complex, and contradictory, and those qualities just don't grab the headlines. No matter that in Canada he was a cowboy, a navvy, a journalist, a poet, a playwright, actor, hobo, and soldier in the American Army. Then back in England, a radical congregational minister in Walthamstow, a revolutionary Christian, a socialist, a feminist, and a pacifist in the First World War, and an inveterate lover of women, a leading Catholic commentator, and that's just about the list. Sure, that rich life did earn him an obituary in the Times, but he was barred from the top honours. So my talk is based on my biography of him, Between Heaven and Earth. This is the cover and the back. Nevertheless, despite these shortcomings, it's still a great story. And as a journalist, I thought it benefited from the telling. So it inspired me to write his biography, and it's available on Amazon. So let's go back. The James family hailed from Pembrokeshire, where they were farm labourers before moving to Monmouthshire, looking to better themselves. A number of them became ministers in the Congregational Church in Wales, although one Lemuel James, pictured here, he's my great-great-uncle, went off the rails when he was found guilty of forging his stepfather's signature on a bill of exchange, and the poor man did a year's hard labour in Usk jail, breaking up rocks every day. The Jameses lived at Cumbrook Farm near Usk, which in my wanderings I never found, because since 1962 it's been under a reservoir. In this picture, it's the white house on the far side of the valley on the right, shortly before being submerged. It's now underwater, yeah. It was here that Daniel James, my great-grandfather and Stanley's father, decided to become a congregational minister. So cut to Bristol, where Daniel on the left and his new wife Clara on the right, and their first child Stanley in the middle, my grandfather. He was born in 1869. Thereafter, Daniel continued the family's easterly trajectory, taking up positions in no less than 4 London churches, 3 of which he resigned from after clashes with the deacons. Nevertheless, Stanley's father was highly regarded as a pastor. The Congregational Yearbook said that he had, quotes, one of the most wonderful voices ever given to man, its note being, quotes, a rich baritone full of undertones and harmonies. Well, a lot to live up to then. There was no escape for Stanley on Clara Palsford's side of the family either. Here too, there was a gamut of ministers. What was a boy to do? Rebel, of course. At Whitgift School, Croydon, Stanley skipped lunch and spent his pocket money on books by radical writers. He won a school prize for an essay on Keats and had his poems published in the school magazine. This slide shows writers who were an influence on him. So clockwise from the left, there was W.T. Stead, the founder, they say, of investigative journalism, the founder of the Pall Mall Gazette. He was a social reformer and a medium, and he attended Daniel's church, Stanley's father's church in Wimbledon, and was a friend of the Jameses. Then there was Walt Whitman, top right, the American poet of democracy and personal freedom, whom Stanley idolized. Likewise, bottom right, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American essayist and poet. After school, Stanley spent the next 6 years chucking up his course at Aberystwyth University, studying to become a congregational minister, trying his hand at becoming an actor with somewhat disappointing results. He actually died on stage when he was filling in for somebody else in Newport, South Wales. And he taught at several establishments, one of which was in Richmond, southwest London. And in his lodgings, he befriended the 75-year-old George Julian Harney, and the historians amongst you may know that he was a Chartist. He was Chartism's enfant terrible who believed in violent action. He was still writing articles for the Newcastle Chronicle, and Stanley and he became friends. He's pictured in the middle of the bottom row. And on the stairs of his Richmond lodgings, Stanley bumped into none other than the lofty figure of Friedrich Engels, pictured in the middle of the bottom row. Karl Marx's fellow revolutionary communist. I don't know if they passed words, but anyway, Stanley records it in his autobiography. Stanley, now 23, was as restless as ever. He disliked suburbia and wasn't speaking to his father. So when his brother Norman decided to emigrate to Canada, Stanley joined him. They set sail from Liverpool on the SS Parisian, pictured here, and they arrived in Halifax on the 2nd of April, 1893. It's worth noting Stanley's bleak feelings on leaving. No convict on the point of being transported to Van Diemen's Land could have felt more hopeless of the future than I, he wrote. Faith was dead. Ambition too had succumbed. It's scarcely possible to exaggerate the sense of desolation with which I set sail for the new world. Anyway, they traveled west to Calgary and found work in the foothills of the Rockies. Stanley landed a job on the ranch of W.W. Stewart, a gruff Englishman who hated drifters from the old country. I myself spent 2 summers in Alberta following my grandfather's footsteps, well, trying to. 2 factors aided my investigations. The first was 2 1893 photos of cowboys that I found online in the Glenbow Museum in Calgary. There was a fresh-faced youth among them who didn't look like the other gritty cowhands. These pictures had no captions, so there was no identification, no names. And in these 2 photos, I'm referring, the one on the left is the guy on the far left helping to brand a calf. And in the photo on the right is the guy in the middle, center stage on his horse with his hands on his hips. My sister and I didn't know whether it could be him. So one of the things I needed to find out in Canada was whether that was him or not. While I was there, I met a guy called Jim Bateman, whose grandfather had known mine. On Jim's sitting room wall, there was another photo, and this is it, from the same set, which I hadn't seen before. And there is that same fresh-faced youth in the middle of the front row, the only one not wearing his hat. When I showed Jim pictures of Stanley taken in the UK, in England before and after his ranching days. I just put them on the table in front of him. Unprompted, he exclaimed, "That's your grandfather, no question." And I repeated this experiment 4 times with other ranching families whose roots went back to the 1890s, and they all said the same thing. For a researcher, it doesn't get much better than that. Amazing photos, amazing that I found them 127 years after they were taken. It's gold dust, actually, for the book and for the research. Anyway, in his autobiography, my grandfather says that on the ranch he deliberately appeared stupid so that his real self could hide behind a mask. He admits he was lazy, but he liked the camaraderie. Near me, he wrote, lived a former Parisian clown and a Russian count. I had come to a country where everyone was an exile. Then there were Stanley's articles for the Calgary Herald, written while he was still a cowboy. He sent reports of the district to the paper on a regular basis, and on occasions he did indulge in some fake news and got himself into trouble. In the winter of 1895, he wrote 2 farces for the locals to perform in the local schoolhouse, and then promptly reviewed his own creation and performance for the paper. "Does your mother know you're out?" his report runs, was received with enthusiastic applause. This little piece, the author of which is Mr. Stanley James, went merrily from start to finish. Though Mr. James acted in the spirit of burlesque, it was no less satisfactory. It's fair to say that modesty was a trait that seldom troubled my grandfather. On one occasion in 1897, when he delivered his report to the paper in person, the editor gave him the job of deputy. Stanley, by now bored with ranch life, jumped at the chance. He was solely responsible for producing a special edition on the Klondike Gold Rush, which I found in the archives. It's an impressive piece of journalism. But when he wrote an article attacking the unscrupulous recruitment agencies which lured miners from Great Britain out to Canada on false pretenses, the editor sacked him. Too much truth, perhaps. Penniless, he headed south to Lethbridge, where his brother Norman was by now running a general store. He walked alongside the railway track, virtually non-stop for more than 24 hours, too afraid to rest because of the rattlesnakes. This photo on the left is mine, taken 2-3 years ago in Canada, and this is the actual railway track he walked down, south of Calgary down towards Lethbridge, across the prairies. And of course, it was incredibly moving to have traced him to that, and this is where he must have walked, just past my parked car. Very moving. Stanley joined Norman before branching out on his own to sell tobacco and soap to the navvies, building the Crow's Nest Past Railway. Then he became a navvy himself. Well, of course he did. The railway theme continued when he teamed up with a friend who was about to ride the rods as a hobo the 2,000 miles to Toronto. The journey took them 3 weeks, getting thrown off trains and freezing in the prairie nights. It was 1898, and the US-Spanish War was about to kick off. That's the war in Cuba and Puerto Rico. Needing money and perhaps not thinking entirely straight, Stanley volunteered for the army and was sent to Cuba, then to Puerto Rico to fight. What he wouldn't have told his army recruiters was that a Canadian newspaper had already hired him as a war reporter. They wouldn't have liked that, so he had a double job. Out in Puerto Rico one night, when on sentry duty, the soldier next to him started firing at what he swore was the enemy advancing in the dark. Panic spread, and the platoon retreated, but no enemy gave chase. In the morning, a white cow was found riddled with bullets, mistaken in the dark for white uniformed Spaniards. However, when Stanley faced the real enemy, desperate not to kill anyone, He aimed his bullets over the heads of the enemy, intentionally missing him. That surely is the first sign of his pacifism. The war over, he used his payoff money to buy his passage back to England. He was 29 years old. The claustrophobic Wimbledon suburbs were a shock to our returning prodigal. After the wide open vistas of the prairies, he found his father, Daniel, now minister of Christ Church, pictured here, found Daniel dying, and Stanley assumed the role of pastor without any qualifications and perhaps without any Christian faith. Father and son may have made up. I just don't know. The congregation warmed to the topics of his sermons. He wrote, "The egotism of the pulpit was in my veins." Well, Daniel died in 1900 and Stanley was appointed temporary minister. Then he met and fell in love with Jess Healy. The trouble was the Healys lived in Buckinghamshire. But here was the chance for another adventure. After his Sunday evening duties were over, my grandfather jumped on his bicycle and rode 40 miles through the night to her Chiltern village. Romance blossomed and they became engaged. And they made a handsome couple. But time had come to get a proper job. Through Clara's connections, he became minister of the Congregational Church in Teignmouth, Devon. He set up discussion groups, a literary society, and took an active part in the community. He and Jess had 4 children in quick succession. But in 1906, he was offered the post of pastor of Trinity Church, Walthamstow, and accepted, attracted by the challenges of a fast-growing London suburb. Challenges? You bet there were. It all started full of promise. The 1906 Trinity record records how the congregation of 300 plus warmly welcomed the family. But over the next 10 years, my grandfather embraced every progressive political, cultural, and religious movement going, earning himself a feature in the Christian Commonwealth magazine, which stated, "The Reverend Stanley B. James has made a place for himself in Walthamstow, and a very distinct place it is. The bold words which he has preached have made him the centre of a somewhat fierce controversy." The Walthamstow Guardian reprinted the article on the 11th of December 1908, the day before my mother was born. By now there were 5 children. My mother, aged 2, can be seen sitting on the floor on the right. And this is taken in a photographer studio in Walthamstow, but I don't know which one. And here are some shots of places that played a big part in the life of the family. The house they lived in, 118 Grove Road, is in the centre. It's still there today. Trinity Church, of course, bottom left. It's a modern picture. And the Baker's Arms, where Leabridge Road and Hoe Street meet, is about 5 minutes walk from their house, is up in the top left. And the pulpit, which still stands, is where Stanley preached his firebrand sermons in support of socialism, women's emancipation, and pacifism, is on the right, still there today. And here's a rather blurry picture of what was known as Hoe Street Station, and it's now Walthamstow Central. So what were these ideas that Stanley, by now fully qualified, allied himself to? One R.J. Campbell invented the new theology and was pulling them in by the thousands at the City Temple, Holborn. The new theology provided a heady mix of socialism and mysticism, and Stanley fell for it, but many in his congregation left. Then came his membership at the Labour Party. Result, traditional worshippers deserted their pews, only for younger progressives to fill them. Next came suffragism, with a similar outcome: more out, more in. In 1910, Walthamstow was forced into a by-election after its MP, Sir John Simon, was appointed Solicitor General, an anomalous tradition dating back to the 18th century stipulating that any MP appointed to a ministerial post had to seek re-election. And a recent court case, the Osborne judgment, had centred on Britain's labour laws and whether the unions had the right to collect levies from the members from their members to pay for Labour MPs' salaries. But because Osborne, a porter at Clapton railway station, lived in Walthamstow, the fallout from the judgment made it an acrimonious campaign. He'd argued that unions should not have that right, but he had lost. Osborne supported the Liberal cause and therefore backed Sir John Simon. But the ILP and the Social Democratic Federation, of which the social reformer William Morris was a member, tried to force Simon to support their more radical measures, in which they sought the reversal of the Osborne case. They were joined soon after by the women's suffrage group, who organised street corner meetings and processions. Non-conformist ministers, including Stanley, supported Simon, who was re-elected with a majority, and his victory parade through the streets of Walthamstow was a mile long. In 1914, war loomed, and Stanley knew he was a pacifist by inclination. He spent an agonizing 2-week holiday wondering whether to make his pacifism public in the pulpit. He did, and that proved to be the crunch. Large numbers walked out, never to be replaced, and in his congregation, of course, were women whose husbands and sons were fighting on the front. It was a very bold statement to make, given that context. The church was in turmoil. Someone called my grandfather a rotter. Another referred to him as a dipper, meaning he dipped in and out of every trend going. Worse, unbelievably, was to come. Enter 3 beautiful women: Eva Slawson from Leytonstone, Ruth Slate from Manor Park, and Minna Simmons from Walthamstow, all 3 part of the church's progressive arm. Their stories, told against a sinister backdrop of bombed-packed Zeppelins hanging above their East End rooftops, are contained in their diaries and the letters they wrote to each other, and in which Stanley played a large part. These amazing documents are open for reading in the Women's Library of the London School of Economics. So first, Eva, beautiful Eva. She fell in love with Stanley and he with her. She recorded her feelings of longing in painful detail. She wrote to Ruth, "I had a wondrous evening with Mr. James, one of those rare and beautiful experiences difficult to describe. I seemed to live in another world for some days afterwards. I spent the night in a state of ecstasy." Eva's relationship with my grandfather was to remain platonic, and tragically, she died aged 30 of undetected diabetes in March 1916. Scandalous events followed thick and fast. Enter Minna, by now a widow and mother of 4, friend of Eva and Stanley, and they used to meet at Minna's house for lunch. I've found no photo of Minna, but this is where she lived, 16 Grosvenor Park Road, obviously a contemporary picture. But I do have copies of her letters, which are in the Women's Library of the LSE, which are amazing documents in their own right. And this one, written on the 15th of July 1916, with the Battle of the Somme raging, just 4 months after her best friend Eva's death, she wrote this to Ruth. "What I now confess is with the deepest shame and humiliation, yet with joy that one can feel as I have felt is to know the very consciousness of reality. Stanley and I had a most lovely talk. We went into the front room alone and he kissed me, opened my dress and kissed my breast too. And he said how he felt I was his. He was just going away when he came back and pleaded with me to give him everything a woman could give a man. I told him I was sure we should regret it, but anything that would make me his. Well, dear, I did. The tears I have shed have quite washed away any wrong I did. He promised to come to see me and to write. He did neither. It was simply brutal. The strangest thing is that I haven't felt I wronged Mrs. James. No, I felt what love he gave to me was mine and never was hers. Forgive me, your own Minna. That letter I discovered right at the end of my research, just in time to include in the book, found its way into the Virago book of love letters in 1991, sandwiched between love letters from Maud Gonne to the poet W.B. Yeats, and one from Violet Trefusis to Vita Sackville-West. Minna, the nurse from Walthamstow, is in good company then. Enter Ruth. I found 9 letters my grandfather wrote to Ruth. He's desperate for connection with her, the most intellectual of the 3. He offers condolences following Eva's death, then outrageously suggests that her passing could be so that he and Ruth could, quote, be together, close quotes. He turns Christian fellowship on its head by suggesting they become more intimate. Of all my grandfather's transgressions, this is perhaps the most embarrassing because of its deviousness. My Aunt Phyllis wrote chapter 4 of this history of Trinity Church, 1906 to 1916. But it's pretty clear she knew nothing of her father's liaisons with these 3 women, although she would have known them personally. Either that, or she was just being diplomatic. By December 1916, Stanley's time was up. The deacons forced him to resign, his continuing pacifism proving to be the last straw. With a small band of followers, he set up a radical new church which combines socialism and ritual, a sort of high church nonconformity, at Burley Hall, Leytonstone. The hall was used for whist drives during the week, but despite the high hopes of the new enterprise, it folded within months. And these are contemporary photos, and you can still see the mosaic design on the doorstep and the lettering above the door. It's a block of flats now, just down from the library. So the enterprise did fold, but not before it linked up, intriguingly, with the communist-leaning Brotherhood Church in Hackney, where the talks of the anarchist Captain Jack White, a close personal friend of Stanley's, who founded the Irish Citizens' Army, were creating revolutionary waves. Now, without an income, the James family suffered poverty for the foreseeable future, as Stanley attached himself to different organizations. First, there was the Non-Conscription Fellowship, where he worked with a young Bertrand Russell, pictured here. And Stanley recalled how he would, quote, draw the philosopher into conversation by putting some quite foolish question in philosophy, which he would answer with perfect seriousness and courtesy, and at considerable length. I'm afraid our routine work suffered not a little. Then there was the Fellowship of Reconciliation, where he attacked Quakers for being elitist and too gentle. He longed for meetings to be interrupted by a, quote, sweaty, mud-stained and foul-mouthed soldier from the front. It would have been such a relief to have heard somebody swear with real feeling. It was here that he met Fenner Brockway, later a leading light of the Labour Party, the Christian revolutionary Muriel Lester, as well as the proprietor of the Crusader, a pacifist journal that he was eventually to edit. And when he was editor, he hired a glittering array of movers and shakers. I don't know if you can recognize any of these people. As the Red Vicar of Thaxted, Conrad Noel, bottom left. Jerome K. Jerome, author of Three Men in a Boat, top left, wrote for my grandfather. Muriel Lester, the revolutionary Christian who was responsible for bringing Gandhi to this country in 1931, top right. And Sylvia Pankhurst, the suffragist, bottom right, to name but a few. But he clashed with each and every one of them on ideological grounds. And eventually they all refused to write for him anymore. Whoever said pacifism was a gentle business? Finally, there was Kingsway House, which is just behind Bond Street in today's London. And it was under the creative leadership of Dr. Orchard, who was trying to combine the best of Protestantism with the best of Catholicism. Orchard appointed him his deputy, and Stanley could give free rein to his growing regard for Catholicism, even though he failed miserably to introduce Mass to the hardened East End dockers at Tower Bridge when they attended the Kingsway mission there. Stanley remarked ruefully, they preferred billiards to the Bible. The family, meanwhile, were living out a Spartan existence in Somerset and in this house pictured here under the Mendips. To make ends meet, they gathered mushrooms on the Mendips and dispatched them by train to West End restaurants. Vegetables made the journey more often than Stanley did, as far as I can gather. Stanley was drawing closer to Catholicism. Finally, he succumbed, and on the 2nd of July 1923, he was received into the church at the Priory, Haverstock Hill. He talked of a new sense of liberty. How is one to speak of that moment when the ship rotting in the harbour through weary years flings out her sails to the wind and feels the pulsing water of the open sea beneath her? I am conscious that life is only just beginning. He was 53, but poverty still stared him in the face. For a short time, he turned to secular freelance journalism. One of his articles was entitled, How to Write Love Letters. I smiled when I read that. In the end, he abandoned his digs near Tower Bridge and joined the family at their rundown 5-acre smallholding in Hampshire, where they were now living and were to be for the next 18 years. They were still desperately poor, and my grandmother, who had heart problems, always kept a bottle of brandy about her. My mother told me how every day they waited for the postman to see if he delivered a much-needed check from Stanley's freelance writing. Jess, my grandmother, was long-suffering and must have put up with an awful lot. In a cramped garden shed full of tobacco smoke and using a decrepit manual typewriter, Stanley established himself as one of the world's leading Catholic writers. I found hundreds of his articles in 23 publications worldwide. In most of them, he wrote as a columnist, indulging himself in the luxury of the first-person singular. The three main strengths he possessed, the dynamism of the social reformer, the scholar's deep understanding of the scriptures, and an overriding sense of the mystical and supernatural, gave his writing power and insight. He covered issues concerned with authority, the polarities of communism and fascism, tradition versus revolution, distributism and land reform, mysticism and contemporary literature. It was a heady mix, certainly. He even suggested that the Vatican should move from Rome to Dublin, but as far as I know, that didn't happen. Books came out on a regular basis too, 9 in all. His best known, his first autobiography, The Adventures of a Spiritual Tramp, being published in 1925. That book earned him an invitation from the celebrated artist Dame Laura Knight, pictured on the left, to come to tea, to meet the writer W.H. Davies, another hobo and tramp, who lost his leg in a rail accident in America a few years after Stanley was there. So the two former vagabonds compared notes about the life of wandering. Stanley carried out a 3-month lecture tour to the US in 1927, and he went to Rome and Belgium in 1938 to research his new book on the Catholic Action Movement. He consolidated his friendship with G.K. Chesterton, pictured here. He retained the radical thought of earlier years, but it was juxtaposed with new conservative views. He praised Mussolini for reintroducing a Christian society into Italy and pointed out the positive aspects of fascism for the individual because, he claimed, it prevented blasphemy, regulated family life, and prohibited houses of ill fame. He travelled a long way since 1919, when Lenin's picture hung from his office wall. His conversion to Rome had profound repercussions for the family. He tried to force everyone to follow him, but in the end, only Jess and the youngest child, my Uncle David, did so. One aunt told me his Catholicism tore the family apart. With he and Jess now based in Hertfordshire, at the age of 72 in 1941, he was asked by the editor of the Catholic Herald to become his deputy. He accepted and loved it. The full-time job back in Fleet Street meant he had to spend the week in London, so he found a bed in a Belsize Park doss house, where he shared a room with 2 down-and-outs. No working from home in those days. He wrote a column every week, regular book reviews, and became a voluntary fire watcher during the war. And here's just a collection of 5 of his column pieces, a varied themes. You can see there, 1 a week. He wrote a lot. In 1945, with his services no longer required, he moved back to live with Jess in the pretty flint cottage they rented. There were even roses round the door, but forget any idea that they might now live out their days in comfort. The house was without mains electricity or gas. Water had to be drawn from a well in the garden and then heated on a wood-burning stove when the toilet was outside. His brother Norman, now a retired politician in Canada, sent a joint of choice ham every Christmas. And the 7 children, now all grown up, helped with handouts. The brothers hadn't been in touch for years, and Stanley was desperate to re-establish contact. It is very, very good to have this token of continuing affection, he wrote to Norman. You are the only living link with early days. During that summer of 1951, there was a family reunion, and the picture commemorating that is in the middle of the bottom row. That crowded the crowds of the family there. I was taken there, and my mother told me Stanley blessed me. But he was soon to fall ill, and in November he died from stomach cancer in St Mary's Hospital, Paddington. His obituary in the Times and notices in countless other religious journals spoke of his learning, his kindness, and his youthfulness. All true, but they, all male writers, of course, didn't know half of what had gone on. And I doubt my uncles and aunts did either, or at least only hazily. One mystery remains. Who decided on the inscription on his grave in Abbots Langley churchyard? It goes, "Strong and content, I travelled the open road." As he was a committed Catholic, one might have expected some Christian words. Instead, we have a famous line from that most pagan of poets, Walt Whitman. Perhaps, though, unwittingly, the quote has hit the nail on the head. He was a man too contradictory and complex to ever achieve fame, but precisely because of that, he was left free to live a life of adventure, of the mind, body, and the soul, caught between heaven and earth. I've only been able to, in this short talk, to scrape the surface of Stanley's life. So if you'd like to know the full story, well, you'll just have to buy the book. Thank you very much for this last slide. It gives you a few details, which I think Francis has sent around anyway. So it can be bought through my website, robertnurden.com, or directly from Amazon. Make sure you buy the second edition because it's just updated ever so slightly. So thank you very much for listening. Nice to meet you all. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that fascinating talk, Robert. And in particular, your use of images was so evocative of, you know, all the areas of Stanley's life. And it was great to hear your story about how you came by some of them as well on your own travels. So that was really, really nice to hear. Please do put your comments and questions into the chat box so then I can ask them to Stanley, because I think it will go a little bit more easily than if I unmute you. I've got a few of my own to kick off with though. So Robert, I mean, your own life as a writer and journalist, does that affect how you view your grandfather Stanley's life? And how do you think your own career in that circle differed from his?
Good questions. Because I never knew him, we overlapped by 7 months. I'm not sort of overburdened with close links to him. So I thinking about it, I was just about the right distance from him to be able to feel, oh, this man is my grandfather, but also at the same time to be objective as well, and I give him quite a hard time in the epilogue in the book, and I think the hero of the book is really my granny, for all that she put up with, and who knows what else she might have had to put up with that I haven't been able to find out from the research. So I was able to put my journalism hat on and look at the story objectively as well, and that juxtaposition worked really well for me. My mother once said to me, "You're so like my father," but at the time I took as quite a nice compliment. But now that I know all this, I'm not quite so sure. But I've always liked writing, and Stanley's always written, and writing does run through my family. And I see my second cousin Susanna is here, and her father was hello Susanna. Her father was a published novelist as well. So it runs in the family, doesn't it, Susanna?
Obviously some sort of writer's gene, I guess. Do you think that Stanley's life in Walthamstow for that period of time was a particularly important moment, or was it kind of one episode and among many?
It was absolutely central. Being a congregational minister, there's less compared to Methodists and Baptists. There's no central office of administration that a congregational church is answerable to. So he had free reign. to explore these the new theology, socialism, pacifism, and all these other things. And my criticism of is that he didn't really carry people with him. He did, as he was called, a dipper. He dipped in and out of these movements. And any good minister will work with the congregation that's in front of him or her. And that I think he liked a reviewer once said about him that he preferred ideas to people. And at the end of the day, I think that's it. So Walthamstow is where all that cauldron of belief and pacifism and being driven to make a better society, that's where it all peaked. And the time in Teignmouth, which is sort of 5 years, was like a dress rehearsal for that. And it broke. He got asked to leave, and it's something he became a Catholic in 23. Was it guilt? Was it tiredness? He had no answer to anything anymore. He wanted a refuge. I haven't really been able to answer that. But no, Walthamstow is the absolute key 10 years in his life, without a doubt.
I think it was really interesting how you reflected on, obviously, as you just mentioned there, the ebbs and flows of his congregation, but also, as you mentioned earlier, the sort of various networks of non-conformity and radicalism that, again, were sustained for short periods of time, and then people sort of went their own separate ways. Do you know if his pacifism was still in evidence or an important part of his theology and politics by the time the Second World War came around, Robert?
Well, he was a voluntary fire watcher in the Second World War, but I think the key year is 1923, and once he became a Catholic, the radicalism in the extreme form of the early years of the 20th century just stopped, and he became quite a traditional Catholic and quite conservative. So if he'd been asked, are you a pacifist, he might well have replied, but it wasn't a preoccupation with him. He was turning very much to the Bible and became a great authority on the scriptures. So I think, to answer your question, Francis, pacifism was just not important anymore. Although he was quite right wing in his views through the 30s. Yeah,
it's quite an interesting change, I suppose, from those two sort of eras in his life. Was there a particular part of Stanley's life that you found enjoyable or interesting to research, Robert?
Well, it was all pretty amazing, and because he was not. He wrote 2 autobiographies actually, and he's rather vague about place names and terminology and dates. So I had a real job in Canada tracking him down, and he changed the names of where he was. So that's why I had to go back a second time to correct my mistakes on the first time. So that was a sort of geographical challenge, but the far more intriguing one, and if you've got 5 minutes, I could go into the letters and diaries of the 3 women in Walthamstow. It's a for people researching history, it's quite an incredible story.
Please do.
It all started. I did an idle Google search, and I put in Stanley James Rockies, and some entries came out, references to his books, but also a reference to this book, The Match Girl and the Heiress, by an American historian called Seth Coven. And the heiress is Muriel Lester from Loughton, who Stanley worked with, and she was the woman I mentioned in the talk who was instrumental in bringing Gandhi to this country. But down in Bow, she set up Kingston House with a woman who worked at the matchbox factory in Bow, and together they were both revolutionary Christians. She also set up a group called the Voluntary Poverty Movement, which my grandfather was part of. And on page 321, after I did this search, this turned my whole research of my old book on its head, because this is what I read. The signatory who most egregiously violated the spirit of their Christian revolutionary vow was Stanley James. A man of roving ways and unsettled religious convictions, he had been a cowboy in the Canadian Rockies and a rail-riding hobo in the American West. When he returned to Britain, he assumed his father's Methodist pulpit in Wales, married and started a family. He eventually drifted to London, apparently without his wife and children, where he worked for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, sometimes edited The Crusader, and delivered stirring pacifist socialist sermons to his non-conformist Walthamstow congregation. He also grotesquely abused his ministerial authority to seduce idealistic, vulnerable female congregants. And he goes on to say that he lured them to the vestry at Trinity Church and seduced them. Well, this is the first I heard of it, and I was absolutely shocked. I knew my grandfather wasn't a paragon of virtue, but he was basically a good guy, I thought. And then I read this. So where did this, I emailed this guy immediately in America, and he wrote back the same day and said, I'm so sorry to give you this shock. My source was another book, which I've also got here. Sorry, this goes on a bit, but it's intriguing. This book, which is in the Vestry Museum in Walthamstow, Dear Girl, by Teal Thompson. And Teal Thompson, through family connections, had access to Ruth Slate's belongings after she died in the Blackheath basement house, basement of a house in Blackheath. Letters and diaries from three girls that I've mentioned. And she spent months and months processing these. She produced a play called Dear Girl, which toured the country, and then she produced this edited version of the diaries and letters of these three girls, which they all thought would be secret and never known, and they're in the Women's Library at the London School of Economics. I arranged a supper so that when Seth Coburn was over from America, and Teal was available, and a cousin of mine, and we all met in a tapas bar in Exmouth Market. And Teal was a fierce feminist from the 80s, and as soon as she saw Seth Coburn, she challenged him, said, "Was my book the source for your 1.5 pages?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Well, you made it all up." And it's absolutely true. The vestry was not used by my grandfather to seduce people. And in 1.5 pages, 321, 322, he made 9 mistakes. This is a respected historian. So the only thing for me to do was to read Teal's book, which is great and reliable because it's all quoted, and also to go to the Women's Library and to read all these documents, 10 boxes belonging to Ruth with all her belongings. Quite incredible in their own right. Amazing documents, nothing to do with my grandfather. So, Francis, that was the most intriguing part of the research, was untangling all that material. And of course, Teal had looked at the letters and diaries from the point of view of the relationship between the 3 women. And my grandfather has, I think, 40 mentions in her book, in her letters, but it's a kind of walk on part. I went back when looking at the letters with a different perspective, where he is the central figure, and I found lots more references, including those 9 letters to Ruth, which Teal had never seen. She and I have become very good friends, and some months after that, we booked a day back in the library, at the Women's Library, and she was revisiting her material 30 years on from when she'd first read it, and her little pencil markings were on the letters, and I was rereading some of the letters, and it was just, for each of us in different ways, incredibly moving. And in Eva, just to say one more thing, Eva in her diary records she was put in charge of a Wednesday evening girls group meeting, which Stanley's daughters went to, and she said at one point, Kitty and Chrissy and Anna made a wonderful recital of a poem and a song, and the girls were all happy. Kitty is my mother, age 7, and this is like a sort of a bolt from the blue coming from Eva. And I read this in the women's library, and I let out a gasp of disbelief. So research can be very emotional and can be great fun. So that's really my answer to your question.